Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a special session of the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. And today we are delighted to be both in person and online to feature a just published book entitled Zhou Enlai, A Life, published by Harvard University Press. And our author, Chen Jian, is here today. He is a distinguished global network professor of history at New York University and NYU Shanghai, the Shih Professor of History Emeritus at Cornell University, and a global fellow here at the Wilson Center. I'm Eric Arne from George Washington University, and I co-chair the Washington History Seminar with Christian Osterman of the Wilson Center. As many of you know, the seminar has been a collaborative and nonpartisan venture of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy program and the American Historical Association. A couple of quick things before we get going. We are pleased to note that today's session is being co-sponsored by the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Second, we like to recognize some people who, behind the scenes, work hard to make these seminars possible. Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center, Rachel Wheatley of the AHA. On the logistics front, please note that today's session is being recorded. We're live and we're webcasting it, and the recording can be found on our respective websites in the near future. Fourth, our schedule of seminars beginning in September will be announced shortly, and those of you on the mailing list will be receiving that note in the near future, and those who are not on the mailing list, well, get on the mailing list, and then you can find out what we've got planned for fall. And then finally, today's session is being chaired and moderated by Charles Kraus, the Deputy Director of the History and Public Policy Program here at the Wilson Center, and I now turn over the moderating responsibilities to him. Chuck.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric, and thank you all for joining us this morning for this book talk about Zhou Enlai, A Life. As you heard, Dr. Chen Jian is a distinguished global network professor of history at NYU Shanghai, and he's also the Shih Professor of History Emeritus at Cornell University. I'll just say a few more words about him before giving him the opportunity to tell us about his book. So if you're familiar at all with Chinese diplomatic history, you know the name Chen Jian. He is the author of several classic works in the field, including the 1994 China's Road to the Korean War, which explained the Chinese decision-making process in the lead-up to the dispatch of Chinese troops to Korea in October 1950 in the first and hopefully only U.S.-China war. He's also the author of the 2001 Mao's China and the Cold War, which is still often referred to as the quintessential book, single best overview of Chinese diplomatic history after 1949. And to those two books, we now have this one. Chen Jian has been a close partner and friend to the Wilson Center for many years. He is a Wilson Center Global Fellow, and he is the author of numerous Wilson Center publications, including the first ever Cold War International History Project working paper all the way back in the early 1990s. Professor Chen was also a critical player in the opening of the Chinese Foreign Ministry archives in the early 2000s, and he worked with the Wilson Center and other stakeholders to ensure the widest possible distribution of these declassified Chinese diplomatic documents. Many of these sources are still accessible today on the Wilson Center Digital Archive, even as they are no longer available to researchers in person in Beijing. And that's a credit to Professor Chen Jian. So we are delighted to host him for this discussion and launch of Zhou Enlai, A Life. And following remarks from Chen, we will hear from a panel of expert discussants, Meredith Oyen, Jude Blanchette, and Robert Daly, who I will introduce in turn later on. So, Professor Chen Jian.
And, thank you, Eric and Chuck, for the introduction. Yes, I'm an old affiliate of the Wilson Center and also AHA. And I regarded them as two of my academic homes. And as Chuck had said, since the early 1990s, I have been doing so many things with the Wilson Center and the former director, Jim Hirschberg, and then David Wolf, and now Christian Osterman. We are not just colleagues, we're comrades in arms. We're friends. And also AHA. Since the early 1990s, I have been an AHA life member. It's very unusual for a person who was still a late-stage PhD student at the time. And having said this, I also would like to thank one person who is not here today, my dear friend and a former colleague at the University of Virginia, Mel Leffler. He was the person who got me embarked upon this project, Zhou Enlai project. And in 2004, Mel talked to me, saying, Chen Jian, I'm editing a series on great statesmen and politicians of the 20th century. Why don't you write a brief biography for Zhou Enlai? And yes, that was 2004. Mel actually, in order to hook me into that project, telling me, you probably only need 6 weeks to complete that book. Yes, that was 2004. And this year, it's 2024. 20 years have passed. Why did it take so long? And first and foremost, Zhou Enlai was not an easy person to write about. Zhou Enlai was born in 1898. He died in 1976. And during that long span of time, China experienced crises, wars, and revolutions. And then Mao's infamous continuous revolution programs. And he went through the late Qing period, the establishment of the Republic, the May 4th era, the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party civil war from 1927 to 1937, the Chinese War of Resistance against Japan from 1937 to 1945, and then the CCP Kuomintang civil war from 1946 to 1949. After communists take over of China's political power in 1949, with the establishment of the People's Republic, Zhou Enlai served as the People's Republic's premier continuously for 27 years, including 10 years as the PRC's foreign minister. On the international scene, those period of involving in a political and diplomatic life witnessed first the First World War, then the Second World War, then the Cold War. And he played a major role in the making of the Geneva Conference and its accord of peace in Indochina of 1954. He was a central figure in the Asian Afro Conference of 1955, which was held at Bandung, Indonesia, so it was known as the Bandung Conference. He was also one of the first initiators of the 5 principles of the peaceful coexistence. And finally, among many other things, I would like to highlight the Chinese-American Shanghai Communique of 1972, which I would like to argue was an unprecedented and fundamental document, not just important for Chinese-American relations. It was also important for international politics and international relations as a whole, even entering the 21st century. It is no easy matter to try to write about Zhou Enlai. And I'm a historian. I'm a historian who believed in archival, a primary source research. And the time when I agreed to write about Zhou Enlai, it was a time of huge challenges and seemingly enormous opportunities. This was the time of the golden age of China's archival opening. As Christian have just mentioned, Chinese archive began to open in the late 1990s. And I still remember, in 2006, and together with the Wilson Center and the Historian's Office of the State Department, we signed an MOU with the Chinese Foreign Ministry Archive about opening complete declassification and opening of documents related to Chinese-American rapprochement. The sky was so blue. The sun was so bright at the time. So I actually did not start writing the Zhou biography until 2014. Why? There's so much to explore. You know, I was just like a hungry kid to be brought into a marvelous candy store. What do? You enjoy it. And then you start eating it. And finally, you start to try to produce some kind of reflection. Things have changed. Things have changed. Not just Chinese Foreign Ministry Archive, but also various provincial and municipal archives, where so many documents were made available to scholars, including many of Zhou's internal speech, including even Politburo meeting minutes. And in 1999, I had an opportunity. Two colleagues of mine, Chinese colleagues, we went to do research at the Fujian Provincial Archive. We sought the support and help from a gentleman whose name was Xi Jinping. He was then Fujian's provincial governor. He gave his full endorsement of our effort. And this was the time, I still remember, I was able to access a critical Chinese Communist Party Politburo meeting minute dated April the 11th, 1965, about the escalation of the Vietnam War and China's strategies to deal with it. Sky was so blue, the sunshine was so bright. This was the time. And it had changed. And that also made me finally to start writing this Zhou Enlai biography. I still remember the day was April the 20th, 2014. I wrote the first line formally of the prologue of Zhou Enlai biography, at that time entitled Zhou Enlai, The Man in His Times. I lost my notes.
I think the screen's locked, so you might have to just unlock it.
No, I will not do I will do without it. And so, let me start telling the Zhou Enlai story. There's so much to say. And I encourage people to read the book. Zhou Enlai is not a person whom you just try to listen about. Especially with the production of this biography, probably there's a more desire on people's part to read about it. But let me try to emphasize just two important episodes and also aspects of Zhou's life. First, I think it's important to try to understand the complicated relationship between Zhou Enlai and Mao. That was because most of the era Zhou lived through was called Mao's era. China was called Mao's China. And Zhou Enlai was working with Mao closely since the late 1920s to the mid-1970s, when both passed away in the year of 1976. And they have done much. Yes, they won the Civil War. they established a so-called New China. This New China was not without its accomplishments. An age-old phenomenon, China's gentry landlord class was eliminated. Be good or not be so good, it happened. Chinese people's education literacy rate and also life expectancy had increased. Women who had been completely sidelined under Mao had gained at least a nominal so-called liberation. And the slogan, "Woman represents half of the sky." And also China's industrialization and the path toward modernization were launched. Despite all this, under Mao, China also witnessed some of the darkest chapters in Chinese history and even human history. The Great Leap Forward, which was followed by the Great Famine. And then the disastrous, the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. In all of this, good things and bad things, Zhou was with Mao. Therefore, many call Zhou a Mao accomplice or a Mao enabler, who enable Mao to do all those things, to be good or to be bad. How should I try to regard Zhou? Indeed, with his extraordinary administrative and executive capacity, Zhou helped Mao and the Chinese Communist Party govern China. Zhou had a very high status in military sense. That was because he was the director of political affairs at the Huangpu Military Academy, the cradle of China's military commanders. And therefore, many of the nationalist and communist journals were Zhou's students. Further, Zhou was also the CCP's and the PRC's biggest spy master. Intelligence depends upon links. Zhou was the end terminal of those links, controlled those links. And so no doubt, Zhou enabled Mao to do many things. But at the same time, in my study, also find that Zhou was not a genuine Maoist, certainly not an internalized Maoist. There was some fundamental and basic differences between them. Okay, now I must try to read some quotes, so I need my notes. So please bear with me. I have gone through a lot without notes, and now I will do this. And so there are some very fundamental differences between Mao and Zhou Enlai concerning revolution. Their definition about the revolution was different from Mao. Revolution began with destruction, and in most cases also ended with destruction, because there was something Mao named continuous revolution. Mao even argued in the philosophical sense, destruction was important. Only when destruction was underway, construction would begin. No wonder Mao's revolution was so destructive. And what made this philosophy, it's not just a philosophical statement by, I don't know what the rate of philosopher Mao was in terms of philosophical knowledge, but anyway, it's not something in the study. It was associated with some of the most dramatic utopian visions concerning transforming China into a land of universal justice, equality, and prosperity, and transforming the Chinese peoples in the most world to make them so-called new citizens in the living, in the known universe. And all this was also accompanied and supported by unrestricted power. Power so absolute that the statement, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely becomes such a light statement. It goes beyond people's imagination. So, for me, I believe, now I try to change some order of my presentation because I intend to discuss this part toward the later part of my lecture, but now I will jump to this stage to talk about revolution. I believe revolution is no thing. Revolutions happen for a reason. If the vice of the old regime had not reached the degree beyond self-repair, a revolution would not have happened. But revolution was bloody, often destructive. And the revolution had its downside. And a radical leftist revolution guided by dramatic utopian visions, which was supported by unlimited, unrestricted power, controlled by the victorious revolutionary, was the most dangerous. There was the possibility, there's a likelihood, there was a prospect that China under Mao, especially during the Cultural Revolution, could have been destroyed. Mao did this, people, if you're familiar with the history of the Cultural Revolution. Zhou, different from Mao, he was a believer in construction. Further, as means of revolution, Mao believed in struggle. A famous Mao statement was that for 8 million Chinese people without struggle, how could they move forward? 8亿人口不斗行吗? Without a struggle, how can they live? Zhou was different. In an age of revolutionary extremism, Zhou was the force, the central force of political centrism. Zhou believed in the value of pursuit of compromises. He was not just a believer in it, he was a master at practicing it. Mao looked down upon intellectuals. For him, intellectuals were the products of the old time. Zhou believed in intellectual power. He believed that intellectuals should be regarded as the main force for China's rise, modernization. You know, even more fundamentally, I also find some basic difference concerning the relationship between individual and the collective between Mao and Zhou Enlai. And this was, I hear, in my book, I quoted and I called discursive encounter between Mao and Zhou Enlai. And this was about so-called diplomatic, the democratic centrism. And let me try to find it. Okay, I cannot find it. Let me just paraphrase it. According to Mao, the so-called democratic centrism was a political atmosphere in which centrism should be accompanied with democracy. Discipline should be accompanied with freedom and personal ease of mind, 心情舒畅, should be accompanied with will of unity. A few weeks, this was in 1957, summer 1957. A few weeks later, when Zhou Enlai talked about the same thing, he talked about proper, adequate democratic centrism And said that, what is it? It should be democracy and centrism, freedom and discipline, for development of individuality and will of unity, to put all those individual viables, values ahead of those collective values. If this is not clear enough, I would like to highlight another archival discovery. That was in May 1959, when Zhou was inspecting the Hebei countryside. This was already on the eve of great famine, and Zhou asked the local leaders to give the peasants 6 freedoms. Okay, and while he said this, in summary, he mentioned that self should be in existence in the collective. We should walk with our 2 legs. Even small self should still be allowed to exist in the big collective. Without individual self, how could the collective come into being? I think people living in the United States are familiar with it takes a village and it takes a person. Zhou was more than this is not just, this is a general philosophical question and political issue, right? But in the communist context, it with more dramatic meanings than what we find in the presidential debate in the United States. What does it mean? Zhou Enlai. No wonder Mao never trusted Zhou. Mao never trusted Zhou. And in my book, I highlight one of my findings, the so-called Zhou Enlai Kissinger scandal, which actually is a very interesting story, but I have no time to go into detail of it. Please read my book. You will find it. Okay, finally, let me try to highlight the long peace between China and America in the wake of the Korean War. You know, I don't know if people have noticed that in the wake of the Korean War, after the Korean War, in the heyday of the Cold War, there were total hostility, confrontation between China and the United States. And each regarded the other as the most dangerous enemy. And the United States of America, US imperialism was not just an international issue, it was a huge domestic issue which was used as the source of excess of domestic mobilization by Mao. And for China, for America, Mao's China was compared with the Soviet Union with a more daring, that's from the document, therefore more dangerous enemy. For the 2 countries, there were opportunities, there were occasions on which they could run into another direct Korean-style military confrontation. 1954 in Indo-China, we knew the domino theory. 1954 and 1958, Taiwan Strait crisis. In both cases, US military, the 7th Fleet, were involved. Especially in 1964, 1965, with the escalation of the Vietnam War. And it was very, very likely that China and the United States vividly, if you read the open statements, they could get into another Korean-style direct military confrontation. On all these occasions, one person played such a role to try to make the situation, the hot, explosive situation, to calm down. It was Zhou Enlai. In 1954, in trying to make a peace accord at Geneva, Zhou Enlai met with Ho Chi Minh. In the talk, he quoted the lesson China had learned from the Korean War. The most important is to prevent an American military intervention in Indochina from happening. Ho Chi Minh listened. So therefore, there was a July 5th instruction of the Vietnamese Labour Party, which is Communist Party. And working together with British and especially French colleagues in Geneva, Zhou Enlai and others have produced the Geneva Peace Accord. And in 1965, Zhou Enlai repeatedly issued warning signals to the United States, to Washington, first from Pakistan. He thought Pakistan was an American ally. Unfortunately, President Johnson thought that our Pakistani president, Ayub Burhan, was too pro-China, therefore canceled his state visit to Washington. So Zhou Enlai's first effort to deliver a message to the United States: do not intervene. If you intervene directly in Vietnam, we will intervene. We will. We are ready. And if our intervene occurred, the war would end up with no limit. Finally, he thought someone, the British. The British charge d'affaires in Beijing at that time was Mr. Hobson. He was nobody. No one cared about him. And suddenly he received a call from Chinese Foreign Minister Chen Yi saying, come to see me. And then Chen Yi told him, on behalf of Premier Zhou Enlai, I want you to deliver the warning message to the White House. Can you do that? Hobson said, of course, I could do that. You know, how can you find a better person than we to deliver such a message? Do not intervene. We are ready to avoid another Chinese-American showdown with the message. In 2 days, the message was at President Johnson's Oval Office. In 3 to 4 days, the Chinese got the response. Hobson was thinking there should be other questions to discuss. British-Chinese trade, Hong Kong. No one cared about him. He was sent back to cold bench again. However, the Vietnam War never escalated beyond U.S. military involvement in South Vietnam by sending land troops. Bombardment of North Vietnam, south of the 20th parallel, keeping a safety zone between that bombardment area and Chinese territory. Should we give credit to all those involved, especially Zhou Enlai? In entering 21st century, when we find all those tensions between China and the United States today, could we say that the tension between the United States and China today were more serious than the tension and total hostility between China and the United States and in the heyday of the Cold War? If, in that circumstances, a direct confrontation between China and the United States could have averted, why not today? Why not today? Isn't it true that there are many conditions, one of which is that we need Zhou Enlai in Beijing's Zhongnanhai, and especially in whoever's White House. I wish it could again be Joe Biden's, but that's my wish. Okay, let me conclude here. Let me say 2 things here. Zhou Enlai is history, but Zhou Enlai is also legacy. And let me try to argue. My book does not have a conclusion, not largely because Zhou Enlai's legacy is not to be written. Zhou Enlai's legacy is to be highlighted, maximized by the current and the future practitioners. It depends upon which part of Zhou Enlai's legacies will be glorified or maximized. That's one thing. And the second, again, Zhou Enlai is history, but Zhou Enlai is more than legacy. He is also reference. He is also important reference. And Zhou Enlai should be read by many at leisure. The story is informative and interesting. As a political reference to try to see how he dealt with all those kind of challenges. And most important of all, is a vivid case of to what extent political wisdom, diplomatic skill, and then the desire and capacity to try to pursue informed compromises probably is the most important qualities of any people with the power acting in today's political and international scene. Okay, that's my presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Chen Jian. We'll now go to Dr. Meredith Oyen, who is an associate professor at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She earned her PhD at Georgetown University, and in 2015 published her first book, The Diplomacy of Migration, Transnational Lives in the Making of U.S.-Chinese Relations in the Cold War. An expert on U.S. and Chinese diplomatic histories, Professor Oyen is currently working on a project about World War II's displaced peoples in Asia and the international politics of refugee resettlement. The floor is yours. Please remember to turn on the mic before you speak.
Thank you. And I just want to say thank you to Christian for the invitation to be on the panel. I am delighted to have had the opportunity to read this book, and more importantly, to read it on a deadline, so that I could, really encompass the whole thing. But I have to say, I've been carrying it around the house. I've been in school pickup lines. I've had it at the playground. Everywhere I go, I've had the book with me. And my 6-year-old asked me about it, and she asked me, what are you reading? It's big, and it looks sort of uncomfortable to carry. And I told her it was a story about one man's life from the beginning to the end. And so she asked me, when you get to the end of the book, at this point I was somewhere on the long march, so I had a ways to go. But she asked, when you get to the end of the book, will you be sad when he dies? And I didn't tell her that the book opened with the protests over his memorial service, because I thought, spoiler. But I thought that question stuck with me. The entire rest of the story of the book was, are we sad that Zhou Enlai's dead? And I loved the way that it grappled with that legacy. I will say, I want an audiobook. Just, for those of us with long commutes and things, that would be great. But what I think about the book in general, and what sort of my core ideas and my takeaways, and then a couple questions for you, Professor Chen, is it's the core of it is unpacking this complicated political career and the legacy of Zhou Enlai. I think he's got such a generic reputation in the United States as a statesman. He's, of course, highly praised by Kissinger, right? And then, I looked him up, just curious, and I found, on the PBS National Experience site, they said, Zhou is remembered today as one of China's most respected and best-loved leaders, renowned for his brilliant diplomacy, as well as his personal humility and simple lifestyle. Which is a nice encapsulation, but there's a lot more, clearly, to that story. One of the things I think this book does really well is it gives us that insight into that relationship between Mao and Zhou that's just at the heart of this period of Chinese history. And I would say, I describe it almost, it feels a bit like a very unhealthy marriage, right? It's two people who have 50 years together, who are, at times codependent, at times very dysfunctional, at times hate each other and don't want to see each other, at times are very reliant upon each other. It's a really enduring relationship that sort of has an effect on how each of them reacts through everything. It feels like the most enduring relationship of his life. The book itself is based on, there's a term that's frequently used in the book, which is unprecedented, coming before especially events like the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. But I would say that the reach into the variety of Chinese and international archives here is also unprecedented. It is phenomenally well-resourced. But that incredible research gives us a chance to sort of see the intricacies of that relationship on a day-to-day basis and how the little decisions as well as big decisions played into the overall relationship. I think it really makes the case well that the evolution of Zhou's trust in Mao and his willingness to concede leadership to him really parallels Mao's consolidation, not just of power, but his consolidation of a central narrative that justified CCP control and eventually would justify some of its excesses. And I want to just give two examples of this, if you don't mind. Oops, my tabs here. There is there's a quote here on page 224 where he says, "In that moment, the lofty cause of the Chinese Communist Revolution became centered on a single person's greatness and the supposed brilliance of his ideas," referring to Mao. Zhou and his comrades had handed Mao total power to make and define the revolution's legitimacy narrative and created no institutions to check and balance such power. So it's highlighting a moment in Yan'an during the Second Sino-Japanese War when power is really shifting into Mao's control and highlighting the fact that one of the things that makes that really possible is that Mao had control over the narrative of why there's a revolution and why it's moving forward. And Zhou, as an administrator, was good at supporting that narrative. That narrative gets consolidated by the victory in the Civil War, but it's really tested through the rectification campaign. And then I think you see, there sort of comes back around on 538. He says, Mao had established his ideological and discursive dominance by combining his communist utopian vision with Chinese patriotism and revolutionary nationalism, which took "We, the Chinese, have stood up" as its motto. In Chinese political development, this dynamic, combined with his unchecked political power and unchallengeable authority, thus made Mao invincible. So that, at that point, you're in the sort of lead up to the Cultural Revolution. And so you can see over those 2 decades that this process by which Zhou and Mao back and forth consolidate that narrative of China, and that narrative of China is what gives the party its power, but it's what gives Mao his power, even in the face of a lot of decisions that to the outsider look baffling, right? Because I think that as an outsider, one of the things you go and look at is, why doesn't Zhou do more to check some of the excesses of Mao? And I think that's a question that also comes to play in terms of his legacy. And this is a compelling narrative for why that was not possible. And it's really built piece by piece through all of these interactions over this long sort of marriage of sorts between these two leaders. I think that the other thing that I find really striking, sorry, I promise this is my last quote, was the narrative of struggle and the building a culture of struggle in support of Mao that also became something that Zhou would sort of move to regret. This is in a chapter about the early 1950s. He says, he created another dangerous precedent. This is Zhou acting on Mao's instructions. When someone was being criticized, that person's history would be arbitrarily and distortedly used as evidence to justify groundless accusations against him. And that's something that comes back into play during the Cultural Revolution and later rectification. So you see here how Zhou was making these little decisions and little interactions with Mao and big decisions and big efforts that then helped to build the style of the power and helped to build and consolidate the power around Mao. You see, I think the purge of Liu Shaoqi emerges in the book as another really defining moment in their relationship, and the idea that you write that history might pardon Zhou for his role in that sort of taking on this issue of what is Zhou's legacy, but there's also a lot in there where you say, surely you could have done more. You want to talk to Zhou and say, no, don't do this. But then you sort of see his big picture of what's going on. So that leads to one of my questions, since I have an opportunity to ask the author, to invoke one of your other earlier works, the question of the lost chance. But this is a different kind of lost chance, right? I'm wondering if there's a compelling case for why Zhou felt he needed to act as he did at each interval. But is there any kind of, or I should say, you make a compelling case why he felt he needed to act at each interval. But if you could engage in a little speculation, do you think that there were lost opportunities for Zhou to put Mao's power into check? I have one other thing I'd like to say, and then you can answer both questions, or neither, it's up to you. The last thing I wanted to ask about is I wanted to know how the sources helped guide the decision to focus so much on the relationship with Mao. I described the relationship with Mao as the most important of his life. But of course, Zhou Enlai was also married to the same woman for 50 years. And she plays a very, very vanishingly small role in the book. I would actually forget that she existed, and then there'd be a sentence that she was like also on the Long March, and I'm like, oh wait, there she is. And so I'm wondering if that's driven by the kinds of sources that were available, that her or if the focus on the relationship with Mao is the more predominant, the more important one, or if there's just not the detail, the personal letters, the personal documents that would be available to talk more about his family life and his personal relationships. Her story, Deng Yingchao's story, was very compelling in that it had to have been a difficult life following this. She must have felt the results of some of Zhou's political decisions. There's clear in here that she lost her only child to stillbirth and pregnancy complications. She was clearly unable or unwilling to have another. They adopted their stepdaughter only to see her imprisoned in the Cultural Revolution on Zhou's orders, and then die in prison. And so everything must have affected her. And so I'm wondering if he was if Zhou Enlai was isolated from his family as a result of his work, or is this just a challenge of the sources available? And that puts that sort of central marriage of Mao and Zhou into the spotlight in a way that has his wife receding into the background. And with that, I'll say thanks.
Great, excellent comments and questions. I hope you wrote some of those down so we can return to them in a few moments. But first we'll hear from Jude Blanchette, who holds the Freeman Chair in China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He is the author of China's New Red Guards, The Return of Radicalism and the Rebirth of Mao Zedong, which was published by Oxford in 2019. And he writes and speaks frequently about Chinese foreign and domestic politics, and you would all benefit from listening to and reading what Jude writes. So,
Well, thank you very much. It's a real honor and pleasure to be here. And I should start out by saying you kindly mentioned that thin volume that I wrote several years ago. When I read a piece of scholarship like this, I am genuinely in awe of the organizational capacity it requires to do as much research as you did and write such a compelling, complex, nuanced portrait of a fascinating individual. And I just think this is a remarkable book. And it's not only a book about Zhou Enlai, it is the story of China in the 20th century. It is the story of this complicated relationship, this dysfunctional marriage, this strained marriage, this frenemy relationship between two remarkable characters in Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai. And I think the framing for some of the comments I'll give as we watch the U.S.-China relationship enter a much more turbulent period, I think it's even more important that we have historical context such that Professor Chen Jian has given us with this book. So a few hopefully not too scattered thoughts. One is I find it's amazing that the central question we seem to be wrestling with Zhou Enlai has really not evolved that much over the decades that we've been wrestling with his legacy. And it's still trying to figure out this individual. Why did he not do more? Could he have done more? Did he do enough? And I think, as you heard from the remarks that Professor Chen Jian just gave now, it's many ways the question that he wrestles with throughout the book as well. Sort of these moments where you can see Professor Chen Jian sort of thinking, why not more? And I wonder, do we need to move beyond this question at some point? Because I read this, and again, this was as nuanced a portrait as you can give of Zhou Enlai. And this is neither Zhou the saint nor Zhou the villain, which we have seen at alternative times over the past several decades as new archival material comes out, and as scant few biographies, but those who have on the official side take Zhou the saint, and on the unofficial side take Zhou the villain. But I came out more depressed than ever with Zhou Enlai as a human being, because the optimistic take is sort of Zhou Enlai as the deep state, operating under Mao, trying at every turn and corner to basically steer the ship in a better direction. That's the most optimistic take, but that's not what I saw. Over and over and over again, and I think Emeritus was mentioning this, you see Zhou in many ways supporting Mao's agenda. You certainly see Mao enabling Mao's agenda. And the skill set that Zhou Enlai brought, you wonder, well, yes, China could have moved in a much more tragic direction, maybe at the margin without Zhou. You see Zhou as a central character over this nearly 3 decades, in the post-Mao, in the post-49 period, when Mao is firmly in control. And so at one point in the book, Professor Chen Jian uses the analogy of Zhou as first officer. And I actually think that's the appropriate metaphor. You don't stay on the ship that long if you're trying to steer the ship in a direction that the helmsman does not want to go in. You'll get kicked off the boat, Shanghai, as they used to call it. But yet here Zhou is, and he stays, and there's distrust to be sure. But as we saw, whether it's Liu Shaoqi or Lin Biao or Deng Xiaoping, if Mao doesn't want someone around, if someone is in the way of the great grand project, they're gone, and yet Zhou is the survivor. The next thing, and of course, because I'm reading this as a American working at a think tank in 2024, I couldn't help but thinking about China's trajectory today. And this is the most optimistic thing I think I can say about Zhou Enlai is, gosh, I wish there was a Zhou Enlai today. Because for all the sins, for all the moral failings, for all the compromises Zhou Enlai made, I am convinced that the absence of a Zhou Enlai might be even worse in the totality of it. And as we see the trajectory that China is under today, and in fact, we were just over at CSIS having a workshop about this yesterday of who are Xi Jinping's lieutenants? Who has any political credibility to knock on the chairman's door and say, we might want to go a different direction, comrade, or even have the ability to fundamentally manipulate events to where worst case outcomes are avoided? Is Wang Huning the closest we have? But I don't know if that analogy is a compliment or not to Zhou Enlai, because the thing about Wang Huning is he's a survivor. And he has found a way to firmly ensconce himself in central decision-making for decades. You don't see Wang Huning as someone who is stepping in, correcting Xi Jinping, saving, we don't know yet, the archives that aren't open, but I doubt we'll see much evidence that Wang Huning has been, fighting rearguard actions on behalf of reformers in the system. I think probably quite the opposite. So this brings me to sort of my final thought, and then I wanted to ask a question, although I fear it may be far too similar to Emeritus that it might just seem like I'm a bad version of her great question. The big takeaway I also had of this is, and here I'm drawing on Professor Chen Jian's remarkable work, not only in this book, but I think in his book about decision-making in China's entrance into the Korean War, and then his masterful book that looks at China across the Cold War, is works like this are going to become all the more essential for us as we try to make sense of China and as we try to navigate through U.S.-China relations in a way that avoids war, because as you see, we're now mostly looking at surface level behavior from China. But as you see in this book, and I was just recently reading Professor Chen Jian's chapter on the decision to shell Kinmen Island in 1958, the so-called Second Taiwan Straits Crisis, how remarkably complex the decision-making was in Beijing between Zhou and Mao. This, of course, is right on the back of Khrushchev's visit to Beijing in late July. So between Mao, Zhou, and Khrushchev, and of course trying to make their own assessments of U.S. perceptions in an environment of uncertainty and pretty remarkable misperception. I feel like in some ways we're back to that. We're having to figure out how Beijing is making decisions looking at the font size of People's Daily and who's in the picture and who's not in the picture of the People's Daily. And so books like this are an important reminder that what you see is not all that there is. And the importance, I think, of big eyes and big ears in moments like this. There are going to be very subtle signals coming out of Beijing that we don't want to miss. And in a way, you can see that the CIA was very slow to see the Sino-Soviet split because it just, and others in the US political system just couldn't believe that these two communist powers had antagonism because they seemed to share many of these ideological imperatives. There were signs that were emerging then, that not all was well, and I feel like in many ways we're back to this. So to end on a huge compliment, now more than ever, the work of Professor Chen Jian is critical, starting with the Zhou Enlai book. But for those who, like Meredith and myself, can't walk around with a Bible, really any of the work by Professor Chen Jian, especially on the Korean War and China in the Cold War, are going to become even more important for us. So thank you. My question. You write in the first part of the book, and you referenced it just now, that revolutions are not accidents, but they have historically justifiable factors. And I thought it's interesting because certainly revolutions occur out of events, but they're not preordained. The work of human agency is absolutely vital. The fact that it was a dozen or so individuals who met in Shanghai in 1921 in the French concession to form the Communist Party, was that an inevitability? I don't think so. So the question I wanted to ask you, and this gets back to the central conceit of the book and really this larger question of Zhou, is the Chinese Revolution, even if it lay on a bed of historical events that helped give rise to it, could have taken multiple different trajectories. Mao could have, if you go back and read some of the FOIA'd, the declassified CIA cables, you see that the CIA predicted 15 of the 0 times that Mao died before 1976. Cables about him being stabbed at the Beijing railway station in 1947. But you could imagine an event where Mao Zedong chokes on a dumpling, dies, and then the revolution takes a different trajectory. In the context of Zhou, are there moments, clear moments, where you think a realistic intervention by Zhou Enlai could have had an outsized effect on the trajectory of the revolution writ large, or more importantly, China's trajectory in that post-49 period? Doesn't have to be the Great Leap Forward, it doesn't have to be the Cultural Revolution, but just some moment where you were most screaming out for Zhou to make a forceful intervention for the good of China. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We'll now get a final set of comments and questions from my, from my Wilson Center colleague, Robert Daly, who's the director of our Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Robert Daly is a recognized authority on China and U.S.-China relations, and you can see him testify before Congress, often speaking in the media, oftentimes in fluent Chinese. He frequently gives 90-minute Voice of America interviews entirely in Chinese. He has served as a high-level interpreter for U.S.-China talks. He has a very interesting career trajectory that began with television and U.S.-China relations, but he's a true authority on China and the U.S.-China relationship.
Well, thank you. Very glad to be here today. Very good to see you again, Professor Chen. Wonderful to have you back. And I'm also very happy to work with the History and Public Policy program. I really think that HAP and your network of historians, the people that you bring into this building, are the intellectual heart of the Wilson Center. I've always admired your work and very, very glad to be with you. I was asked to bring 1 or 2 questions. I have more than that, but most of them come down to the same question, and they're not dissimilar, Meredith's questions and Jude's questions. They concern the man himself more than the plenums and the negotiations and the communiques. And I was aware as I was reading It's a very American question, the normative questions about Zhou Enlai. And you mercifully did not write a psychobiography. And yet, at almost every turn, I think most readers will want you to say, okay, so what do you think? Really, historical sources and archives aside. And that's the source of a lot of these questions. I was also aware in reading this book that I was heavily influenced by my own wide but unspecialized reading in Chinese history, and in particular by Simon Lei's 1984 essay, a short essay, called The Path of an Empty Boat, which was probably the first thing that I read about Zhou. And these of course, are persistent questions, and 37 years of discussions with Chinese friends have all turned around the two interpretations, Zhou Enlai, dark and light, that you have. And so I'm aware of this. I was struggling to escape from that framework. I didn't entirely succeed. Also, I should note that right now I am finally reading Wolf Hall. So I've been thinking a lot about palace intrigue and the role of chancellors and the fate of chancellors who work for megalomaniacs. So this may have shaded my reading a little bit. So a few questions about Zhou, again, which come down to the same kind of question, I'm aware. First, you make it very clear that Zhou's lifelong mission, which he sets on quite early, is to save China, to modernize China. And this had been the common mission of intellectuals, especially those with some international exposure or experience, for several decades before Zhou came on the scene. And you describe how early in his career, when he was in Japan, when he was in Paris and Berlin, and when he was in London, he considered various systems for the salvation of China. He was searching for that. But in your telling, it reads as if after 1922, he then never wavers in his conviction that the Chinese Communist Party, and then later that the Chinese Communist Party very much under Mao, is the only system, is the only approach that can save China. And so I guess the question is, does his intellectual curiosity sort of die? Does he settle all questions after 1922? Or do you see evidence that he continues to study other ideas and ask what will serve China's purpose? As I say, it's not a psychobiography. You focus very usefully on his extremely expert management of a personalistic and brutal system in which he manages to not only survive, but perhaps to help some other folks. And he is also a brilliant diplomat, as is widely acknowledged. And you see this especially in your book at Geneva and at Bandung. I read the Geneva section, especially with great interest. And I think that American historians generally give Zhou similar credit that you do. I would only note that you sort of have Zhou Enlai running the table, which is in some senses true. But of course, at the same time, Mendes France got what he wanted, and Anthony Eden and Churchill got what they wanted. And from a certain point of view, under very complicated circumstances, Dulles and Eisenhower got what they wanted too. But Zhou Enlai clearly a pivotal figure there. But throughout this, and again, this is the same question, and you've touched on this. You said that he believes in construction and political centrism, but the question is always in the service of what, right? That's the next question. So what do you see as key moral principles? Because of course, survival is not a moral principle. It's just an instinct. And glory for China, while a reasonable goal, isn't exactly a moral principle either. So could we ask you to step away from the merely historical hat, and if you would sort of distill this question of who was this guy? Is he just the vicar of Bray? Does he adapt with each successive leader? Is he, and I was thinking along Jude's lines here, is he sort of Wang Huning plus charm plus opportunity? How should we see him? And then I don't really think he is either, but I'd still love to hear your response. And then again, to come back to this basic question, Simon Leys wrote that Zhou's tragic irony was that, quote, this man who generously dedicated himself, soul and body, and throughout the book, this guy works himself to death. The sheer schedule that they maintain and the way that they live in dedication to China is hard to fathom. But, he dedicated himself soul and body to the service of China, but he ended up as the staunchest pillar of a regime that managed to kill more innocent Chinese citizens in 25 years of peace than had the combined forces of all foreign imperialists in 100 years of endemic aggression. So in the end, how do we judge that? I think that's the question, and that I know that you're very aware of. And, despite his successful diplomacy at places like Geneva and Bandung, and absolutely in Beijing and leading up to the Shanghai Communique, as you note, at the end of his career in '76, China has failed. He and Mao have failed. This is a country with barely any polity, no real economy, education in shambles. You acknowledge that difficulty in your introduction, but do you reject entirely the critique? In your opening presentation today, you very much accentuating the positive. And so again, a similar version of a different take on the questions that Jude and Meredith have asked. But then lastly, just it may be too soon to say, but what has the reaction to your book been among your Chinese colleagues in China who have looked at it? What is the current state of views of Zhou? Has it shifted at all, or do we still revolve around this question? And then lastly, I came away wondering, maybe it's the case that where you come down on Zhou, what you believe about Zhou, how you answer this question, is it in fact directly related to where you come down on the record of the CCP? Is it a different form of the same question? In other words, it seems to me in general that those who tend to see the party's rule as more or less inevitable and more or less desirable also tend to emphasize Zhou, the wise and benevolent statesman. Whereas those who are primarily critical of the party tend to see Zhou as forever stained by the party's violence. Is that a fair way to summarize the views? That was one of the broad conclusions I came up with. So thank you.
Thank you, Meredith, Jude, and Robert, for a wonderful set of questions and comments. We do want to hear some responses from Professor Chen Jian, but we also hope to preserve time for Q&A with the audience. So as he speaks, do think of questions that you might want to ask. And make sure you...
When I was listening to these highly constructive, thoughtful questions, I thought this is really the moment I should deeply, deeply appreciate. Critical comments are most useful, not just for the improvement of work, but also for the promotion of intellectual exchange, leading the writing itself, and also the more general understanding, not just history, but all the challenges and difficulties we are now facing in Chinese-American relations, in understanding China. What the hell a direction the current China is going. Will it last long? How do we compare it with the Maoist era in terms of strategies in dealing with this China? What we may learn from all those historical cases of reference. These are excellent questions, important questions. Any history is contemporary history. Here, we see this again. And I see many of the questions here are with the interconnections. So instead of naming everyone, I try to answer what I now come into my mind in my writing. Okay. Lost chance, actually, this is not just your question. And many years ago, when I was talking to McFarquhar, he actually asked me the same kind of question. Was it possible for an alliance to be formed when there was still the time for Liu Shaoqi, Deng Xiaoping, Zhou Enlai, and others joining force to try to force Mao to change the course? That does not mean Mao would be assassinated, be it in Beijing Station or whatever it is, right? I thought that was difficult. Isn't it true? We are now facing the same question about Vladimir Putin. I read one review by Professor Steve Kotkin. He said, we would like to have a much better strategy and policy if Putin one day suddenly would announce the dead. Wow, what kind of victory this was. Everything else would have to change. And in Mao's case, it was even more difficult for them to do so. The communist revolution was not just a political cause. It was also, especially in Mao's China, almost a cause of semi-religion. You know, Mao was regarded as a god or semi-god, and also in constructing his own grand narrative of the revolution. And he was not just given the kind of 1943 authorization of final say on Politburo decisions, but he was also able to make his grand narrative not just the main discourse of communist China, Mao China, and his course of a continuous revolution. Simply any of the others were unable to come up with a counter discourse. You think about it. This is why you find when you step onto this boat, it is so difficult to jump out. And any single one's jump out means meaningless suicide. What is the alternative? What would alternative? And then did everything at the end of the day, Mao's times came as worse than ever before. Actually, an alternative grand narrative, which is the reform and opening, was shaped, especially during the process of Cultural Revolution, and with Zhou Enlai's contribution, the 4-3 project, with Deng Xiaoping's contribution. Okay, talking about contingencies. Yes, if Mao had died, what would have happened? On one occasion, February the 12th, 1972, Mao almost died. Zhou Enlai came to the scene, lost control of his PE. He lost control. And when Mao was saved, and the first thing Zhou said is, Chairman, the power is still in your hand. If Mao had died at that moment, or even earlier, there were other, I will say one occasion was 1932 Ningdu Conference. Zhou was the person in control, and Mao was widely hated. And Zhou Mao had set the presidents, other who were Mao's dissident. He just sent them to death field. Zhou could have said this, Mao, bring him out, and shot him, right? And then everything would have changed. But the history depends on many things, one of which is the so-called chances. And human agencies are important. But at the same time, please pay attention to one statement I made about Zhou, about Mao, including Mao. They made the revolution. They were also remade by the revolution. They were revolution's leading actors. They were also revolution's prisoners. This is the danger, this is the most dangerous part of a radical left revolution like a Chinese Communist Revolution, which combined extraordinary utopian vision, which justified any current suffering with the promise of future heavenly life and with unrestricted power. You think about what kind of a chance for Zhou and others to take the so-called lost opportunity. On paper, it is there. In reality, is it there? So, history is such. It is not always determined by historians, of course. We're writing about history. It's not determined by those participants of history. It's determined by heavenly force. One thing is so amazing. Mao, throughout his life, so many of his family members die. Mao even was not wounded for the slightest time, on single occasion. What does it mean? This is something I think is extremely important, Zhou's family life. Zhou and Deng Yingcao, first the people often ask me, was Zhou gay? I have no evidence. Zhou was a believer in celibacy. Okay, but not a celibacy about sex, but celibacy about marriage. And he at one point, he believed in that. And therefore, when he was in Japan, in his diary, he discussed many things about the essence of love and marriage. And yes, this thing had changed into the late 20th century and 21st century, and many of the gay and lesbian would have said the same thing. But that does not mean Zhou was gay. There was no evidence, absolutely no evidence to indicate that he was a practitioner of homosexuality. There's no such thing. And especially the underlying blame for this was that this had made it an original sin of Zhou Enlai, made him extremely shameful in practicing his normal participation in this Chinese Communist Party decision-making power process. This is complete nonsense. So many communist leaders, Mao included, Mao was a womanizer. And this was widely known by many of his colleagues. So what? It did not impact a single piece of his enormous power. This is not the case. And Zhou and Deng Yingcao, about Zhou's family. Zhou actually had a very, very close relationship with the members of his extended family. A niece of him, Zhou Bingde, lived with him and his family. And Zhou actually paid great attention of his nephews, nieces, and also his cousins, and even the brother. His brother, younger brother, was sent to protection detention during the Cultural Revolution. But this actually was a way also to make sure that his younger brother would experience something much worse, like what happened to his stepdaughter, Shen Weisi, who died in prison. And that was, I did not include the details of Shen Weishi's story in the prison. It was miserable. He scolded the so-called 1930s actress, namely Jiang Qing, in the prison almost every day. So that was something, about his family. Zhou had a very strong sense about his family, but at the same time, he also had to take into consideration of all kinds of political calculations, including how Mao and others would try to use some of the family connections to put him on the defendant's stand. For example, his younger brother was accused of having involved himself in a dinner, small dinner group with Liu Shaoqi's brother-in-law. This was something could have downed Zhou Enlai. And there, Zhou Enlai as a person could have done more, should have done more. Yes, in retrospect, we can always say this, but let us try to put ourselves into his shoes. Let us put ourselves into the larger environment of the time. Each and every time you find Zhou was playing an edge ball. One step short, he was not taking full advantage of his administrative power. One step longer, he could have destroyed himself. And someone say, why didn't Zhou retire? Why didn't Zhou commit suicide? But isn't this a legitimate suggestion for a politician, especially a statesman and politician, with a profound sense of responsibility? I don't know. Some would have chosen that. So many, Laurie Qing, for example, tried to kill himself. Many others committed two of Mao's secretaries committed suicide. But this simply was not Zhou will do. Another question is really about, I can see people's suspicion about in the final analysis, how will this be judged? And this has, again, something to do with Mao and Mao's revolution. Frankly, I do not believe Mao was simply a villain. And I don't know if people have paid attention to a Mao biography, which was published before Zhang Rong and John Holliday's Mao Untold Story by Philip Schott.
Mao Alive.
Mao Alive, before that was Mao, the man who, that is revised version. I think one statement by him, they are all my friends. Indeed, on the 25th Mao's death, and by BBC, I was with Sidney Rittenberg, the man who stayed behind, and Philip Schott on a Mao interview, an interview about Mao. And he said, the difference between Stalin and Mao and Hitler was that Hitler cared about what people are. Stalin cared about what people do. Mao cared about what people think. I think this is a very, very thoughtful, what Mao was, much of Mao's killing was manslaughtering. This was really the product of an effort to try to transform people, not just in rhetoric, but also in political and ideological intention to make them better. This is just like, it's a very, very, very inappropriate analogy. And someone who raised a whole group of cats at home. And so, try to take a shower for them every day to make sure that they would become healthier. It ended up with that most of the cats died. This was a very inappropriate, of course. There's a huge difference between cat and pets and human being. So, in the final analysis, history will have to judge Mao by multiple dimensional standards. We have to do that. That is why I say there were bright times and the dark moments of Mao's era. And Zhou, it so happened that much of the making of the bright times of Mao's revolution and revolutions were with Zhou's contribution. I would have to say that Zhou was not just a Mao enabler, he was also a Mao controller. Only by becoming under Mao during Mao's era, only by becoming a Mao enabler, either for those good things or those bad things, unwillingly even, and he would become a Mao controller. Would China have been made better if Zhou had done differently? My answer is absolutely no under Mao, unless you get rid of Mao. Would China would have become worse? Certainly, absolutely. There are upsides, there are downsides of the story. Then moral judgment. Any such biography about a revolutionary, about a person who had been involved in so many different encounters, and it will have to be a very vulnerable case in face of history's moral court of judgment. And this even in China, this was also true because the communist revolution had that such a high standard of moral, pursuing for everyone. And then each and every violation of the moral standard they had set for everyone, including themselves, would become undermined with all kinds of moral breakdown. And in the case of China, I think the challenges China are facing today, one of that was a moral crisis. And one lesson we should have learned from the history of Mao China and Zhou Enlai's story is that it is much, much more important to try to defend and maintain moral borderlines than to try to pursue so-called moral high ground. And therefore, in my own writing of the story, I say it is not just criticism. It will also have to be self-criticism. Because no matter to what extent I try to stand above history, in the final analysis, I was also a product of the Maoist era. If that is the case, how about judging Zhou Enlai, right? Wang Huning, I have known Wang Huning for many years. Back in the 1970s, I could have never imagined to link the Wang Huning I knew then. He was a promising scholar, did not speak much, and become such a grand survivor in 3 generations of very different Chinese leadership. This is enormous. But his survival and Zhou Enlai's survival were different stories. Zhou Enlai's survival was accompanied with some extremely positive occurrences. Wang Huning, I still remember 3 representations he designed for Jiang Zemin. Where is it? I believe 3 representations was a high time of Wang Huning. It was so thoughtful. People talking about, now the Chinese Communist Party would also accept the capitalist bourgeoisie, right? And the party would have been a different one. And instead of representing the so-called advanced social forces of proletarians and working class, it is representing the best interests of the Chinese people and also the civilization, human civilization. Where is it? Zhou Enlai actually, from, who asked the question about if critical thinking, when he was trying to embrace communism, was there later cases in which we find critical thinking was still there? Yes, indeed. For example, this without the individual self, how could a collective come into being? This was the result of critical thinking. It was a very fundamental question. Frankly, I could have not thought that Deng Xiaoping would have ever stated the relationship this way. Okay, here I would like to say something which I did not put into the biography, but it actually is implied there. There was almost a life expectancy in the competition between Mao and Zhou. Frankly, I do not know if Mao had died before Zhou, if Zhou had survived Mao with a functionable body and mind. What would he have done? What would he have done? I think with all those underlying thinking about all those fundamental relationships, Zhou already, in his last years of life, supported Deng Xiaoping wholeheartedly. Zhou actually was the person who opened some early chapters of reform and opening up. Would he have done more, especially toward political reforms in China, if life had given him 10 more years? I don't know. I did not write this down because I'm a historian. I do not predict or try to judge about things that have not happened. I don't know. I realize my time. We already have reached
Yes, but I think that's a very good place to end
Yes,
the
sorry.
conversation.
I still have not answered many questions. But,
There will be other opportunities to continue the conversation. But yes, thank you, Professor Chen Jian, for introducing your book to the audience here, and for our panel for engaging with the arguments and with the text. And thank you all for coming. And last but not least, thank you to the American Historical Association for co-sponsoring this event. But that's it. Thank you.
thank you so much. You know, I could not have answered all those critical and